Hello, so this is a tutorial on how to calculate the mean and the standard deviation for a set of data that you've collected, and hopefully you followed procedures when you collect the data that gives you a random sample of whatever it is you're trying to measure in that system. And I just wanted to show you that these types of things are actually done. This is a actual scientific report in the Journal of Natural History on the life history of the Rio Grande leopard frog. So that actual leopard frog from the activity where you collect the simulation, where you collected the data, that is a real frog. We really do find it here in ponds and lakes here in our area. It does have a pretty wide distribution. It's the Lithobates berlandieri. And this is just the abstract of the paper, and you go down there, you can see a map of the distribution of where we have records of this frog within our state. It does go further down into Mexico and so on. And as I was looking at this paper, I found a reference to the publication where they actually looked at tadpoles. And this one was published in a different journal called Copeia, which is it's a major journal for herpetologists, which study amphibians or reptiles, and ichthyologists, which study fishes in there. And so this is the abstract, but you can see that the frog itself used to be classified in a genus called Rana. And I remember Rana pipiens when I was in ninth grade. But the genus has been changed because of our newer understandings. This is something that we'll talk more about in a Biology 2 class. But it's the same frog. And you can see that they actually measured several different variables for frogs, and the sample looks like it's 25 there. And one of the things they did was body length here. And they looked at species Lithobates phenocephala and the berlandieri, which is a real ground leopard frog. And you can see that they reported the mean plus or minus 1 standard deviation, and then they gave the range. And there's two ways to report the range. So you want to go and look at how the lab manual says it. They define the range as the difference between the high and the low value. But I think if you report the low and the high value, it actually gives a little bit more information that may be important. They also have some other stuff there involving some multivariate advanced statistical techniques, which we don't need to worry about here. So just to point out that in your lab manual, in the lab exercise we're currently doing is lab exercise 2, there's a section after learning about length and volume and so on called Understanding Numerical Data. And they talk about different ways of measuring what's the central value of your data set that you got. And so some common ways are the mean, which is the average, like the way we learn to calculate average. Median is another one, so you want to make sure you go over those. Those are on the list of things to consider. And they do have some practice questions that you can interact with. And then they go into how to calculate the mean and the standard deviation. And they give a small data set here of 4 values. And this is in the context, I think, of another kind of experiment where they were collecting a certain amount of, it looks like length of shrimp or something. And so they give these values here. And so you can see they set up a table here and they listed 4 values. So in this case, your sample size was 4. In the activity I had you to do, I asked you to take 7 random tadpoles and get the length. And you were supposed to do that for group A and group B. So we're going to go through this table, this calculation. Just want to point out there is some what look like scary formulas, but once we define them, it's be like, oh, okay, these make sense. And so they're defined here. And they go through sample calculation for how to actually get your mean and your standard deviation, and then they report it quite similarly. They give you the mean plus or minus your standard deviation there. There is an activity that we might normally have done if we were meeting face-to-face where we would measure the heights of males and females in the class and then go calculate the mean and the standard deviation. Instead of doing this, this is where that activity with simulation with the frog samples comes in. I also want to point out that this same explanation is also given in lab exercise 1, which we'll be doing next here. And it looks like they have a similar data set here, but this is given in the context of collecting carbon dioxide gas in a fermentation experiment where yeast are fermenting and then they release carbon dioxide gas. And so it's a similar table, and they only gave 4 values. We're dealing with 7. Sometimes you're dealing with a larger data set. Your data set could be 25, like I just showed you in that research paper. It could be 30. It could be more. It depends on your study and how many resources you have to have these replicated measurements that you take. By now you've collected the data from that simulation, and you may have already started filling in this because you're going to submit this with your calculations in there. And right now here in the first column is where you put your original values. Okay, so your original values, you should have 7 for group A tadpoles, and then you should have 7 for group B. And so what I'm going to do here is model how the mechanics of calculating mean and standard deviation without really explaining what it means. There'll be another video you can view to really understand what does the standard deviation mean. But basically, I will tell you this. When you run through these calculations, and what I did was I copied these tables onto a place where I can actually go and do the calculations by hand and scribble them. Then you might do this too. You're going to need a calculator, and you can have a calculator. There's usually one available on your as part of the apps that are included with your system there. And you have a choice of doing the standard or scientific. I would pick scientific. That way you have a square key on there, makes things easier. Okay? And when you're doing these things on quizzes and tests, you can't have your own calculator. You can't use your cell phone. You can't have any devices. The web browser will have access. There'll be a little icon up there. You click on it, it'll pop up a calculator just like this. Okay, so again, the goals here are to be able to go through the mechanics of calculating mean and standard deviation. Okay, and you've gotten your data. So you might do this with a separate paper on the side here, and then you can go back and type in the boxes on your Word file those values so that you can submit it. You can see I have some boxes that were in those data tables that have dotted lines because you're not going to fill those in. There's no calculation, no answers that go in there from these calculations. The reason for this table here is because we have to do some repeated calculations, okay? And a lot of times when we do repeated calculations, we're going to do something else with them, and sometimes that involves doing what we call a sum. So this is the Greek letter, and the Greek letter is sigma, and that means sum, okay? And so you can see that I have that here on the bottom box there. And so what that means is you're going to sum up everything in that table. So what we're going to do is you get your calculator, and you're going to do this for your own data set. And everybody, because what we were doing here was you took a random sample from what was on that simulation PowerPoint slide, and then you went and you took the ruler and you measured it. Everybody's data is going to be different. You might have some similar values, but you're not going to have the exact same set of data. And so you want to get in there and you want to go and use your calculator, and we're going to add up all of these values, and then you can fill in the box there on the bottom. Okay, so that's your sum box. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with the calculator here. And so it was 28. And for small data sets, it would be a good idea if you double check your calculations just to make sure that you put in the right values. I used to always double check to make sure if I got a different answer the second time, I knew I did something wrong, so I would run it again. And so it looks like here the sum for that data set is 224 total. So 224 total millimeters. Okay, and so once we've done that, the next thing we're going to have to do is we are going to figure out what is the number of replicated measurements that we have. What is our sample size? And that's going to be symbolized by n. Okay, so this would be your your sample or your replicate size. In the experiment, you repeat your replicate. You repeat your experiment. Those are replicates. That would be n, the number of replicates. If you go and you sample a population like we did with these tadpoles, then n equals the number that you have there. So we're just going to go ahead and refer to that as sample size. It's very easy. If I ask you on a test, what's the sample size? All you're going to do is you're going to go count how many values they are. Don't count the sum. That's not an original measurement. So there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we put 7 in that box there. And the next thing you're going to be calculating is the mean. And the mean is going to be symbolized as x, which is for the variable, right? In this case, we could use L if we wanted because that's for better with length, right? But once you put a bar on top, that bar has to go on the top, that means that you're getting the mean for the sample. Okay, so I'm just going to write mean for short. And mean means average, right? And how do we get the mean? So let's write a formula here for that, okay, using these symbols. You know when you're calculating average, like for your grades, for example, right? You add them all up, and that means sum. So what are we summing? We're going to sum up the values. We're going to sum x. We're going to sum the individual values, okay? And once you get that total, in order to get your average grade, in order to get the average length, you're going to divide by the number of values. So we're going to divide by our sample size. And when we do that, we get this fancy looking equation for the mean. So this is an important concept equation. Okay, so have we already done that here? Yes, we have. We've gotten to 224. So if we were to plug that into the formula, you're going to have 224, and these are millimeters plus millimeters. Technically, there's millimeters there. And you're going to divide that by 7. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my calculator here. I'm going to get 224. It was already on there. I probably could have just hit divide. Then I'm going to divide by 7. And I get, wow, I happen to get a nice round number. So I'm going to write in here that the average is 32. However, let's go back to this calculator. Sometimes you do the division, you get a whole bunch of decimals. Like you get 32 point or whatever your answer is with lots and lots of decimals. You're going to need to round somewhere. And I'm going to give you a general rule. Whenever you're going to calculate a mean for yours, make sure you follow this rule. Okay, I'm not going to count off for it, it's just proper. Anytime you calculate an average, you're always going to add one more number place than what the original data set was. So here you have all of our original data is recorded to the nearest millimeter. So the next number place is to the right, and there's a decimal understood to be here. So the next number place that you have to record is going to be to the right, and that means you have to add a decimal there. And because there was no actual numbers left, it divided nice and even, you should put a 0 there because you have to add that extra place there because that's the rule, right? And if there was a bunch of decimals, let's say that, just hypothetically speaking, that this total gave us 32.457 and then, and other decimals there. We're going to round right here. And if we do, the answer becomes 32.5, and that's what it would have gone there. Now, because it divided evenly, you're going to add the decimal and put a 0 there because you need to have that one extra digit of precision when you report your means, okay? We're not just making up the 0. We're supposed to round to that number place when we do our means. You always round one extra, okay? Let's say these data were recorded to the 10th, like instead of 28, it was we were recording to the nearest 10th of a millimeter, and this is 28.2. So that means all of these values would have been represented to a level of precision to the nearest 10th. That means your mean would have to be rounded to the 100th place, right? So you always add one extra when you're doing that. Okay, so now that we've done our mean, and this is an equation to remember, okay, right here. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to calculate something called a deviation. And I have the formula up there and the name of it. And so what is a deviation? So a deviation is going to be when you take your original value, and the little symbol I just means the ith value, like the 4th value, 6th value, 15th value, whatever the value is. You're going to take that individual value, sometimes I call it, and you're going to subtract from it the mean. That's why we needed to calculate the mean. So this is defined as a deviation, okay? And you're going to subtract it. So that means we're going to take this value here, 28, and you're going to subtract the mean from it, and you're going to get an answer there, okay? Now you can do all of these one by one. So you would take 28, and you're going to subtract 32.0. Then take 32 and subtract 32.0, 30, and so on. And what you realize here is that the deviations can be either negative or positive. If they are positive, that means that the value that you're looking at was bigger than the average. So a positive deviation means larger than the average, and a negative is the opposite. That value would be smaller than the mean, and so you would get a lower value. So if we were to write this out, you don't have to do this. I could just take 28 and subtract 32 with my calculator, but the calculation basically is going to be this, 28, and then you're subtracting 32.0, and then that answer goes here in this box. Right, so we take that here. I don't really know why I'm coming and doing it in the calc. You could do it in the calculator, it'd be 28 minus 32, and I could have done that in my head. So this is going to be minus 4, okay? And you go down the list. Now you're going to get 32, and you're going to subtract the mean 32. So in this one will be 32 minus 32, and you can use your calculator to say, hey, no, that's 0. I know that's 0. I'm going to stop writing what I'm doing, and I'm just going to do the calculation. So 30 minus the 32, you can go into your calculator and put that in there and go all the way down the list. Now I'm going to tell you this. Sometimes this table here ends up with decimal numbers, okay? If you end up with a decimal in your calculation, go ahead and round to the same level that your mean is rounded, or one extra digit might be even better to avoid more rounding error. Now, the thing I want to point out is you still have to do one more calculation. And that calculation, it might be better to do this calculations one after another. Instead of doing all the deviations, instead calculate the deviation and then go ahead and move to the deviation squared. Okay, so and that would make the calculation much faster. So then you would, because you already have the formula in there. The reason I'm going to go and calculate all the deviations first is because I need to make a point down here. But in practice, go ahead and calculate the deviation and then the deviation squared. So let's say the numbers are very hairy, right? There's a lot of decimals there. You'd want to use your calculator to do this. So let's say we get 28 and 32. I know these are nice round ones, just happen to end up that way. And I get -4 here, right? Well, let's say there's a lot of decimal. Well, right here, instead of erasing that and going down the list here, I can go ahead and calculate what goes in this box here. I'm supposed to square that deviation. And so I just square it. And you can see it gives me the answer right away, and I can write it in. And it'll make the calculations that you do with a handheld calculator or your calculator there on as the app. It'll make it faster. So you go down the list, calculate the deviation, and the deviation squared. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run down this list to make a point about what the deviation ends up giving you down here. 30 minus 32 is going to give me a -2. 30 minus 32 is going to give me a -2. 33 minus 32 is going to give me a +1 because it's bigger. 34 minus 32 is going to give me a +2. And then 37 minus 32 is going to give me a +5. Okay, so these are the deviations for the individual. So 28 has a deviation of -4, whereas 37 has a deviation of +5. By looking at the deviations, you can see which ones are lower, which ones are higher. And the point I want to make is that the average, the mean, is sometimes referred to as a measurement of the central tendency of your data. In other words, where's the balancing point between the above average values and the below average values? And if that's the case, then the positive and the negative deviations should balance out, okay? And they balance out, and that means they cancel each other out. And if we went through here and you added all of these up, okay? So let's say -4 plus -2 plus -2, that's -8, okay? So that's 8, and that's a -8. And then I'm going to get all the positive. This was 0, the second value, +1, +2, that's 3 so far, plus 8, that's +8. So +8, and you get 0. So the sum here is 0. It cancels out, and you don't actually have to do this. I just left it open to show you. You can avoid doing this. And the point here is it would be nice if we had an average measure of the deviations, but you can't calculate an average because the sum is 0. And if we put 0 up on the top in this formula, 0 divided by 7 gives you 0, and you get no information out of that. So this is going to be the reason why we square it. If we square these values here, okay, and again, when there's decimals, use the calculator. There will be a square key on there. When you square it, what happens when you square a negative number? The negative disappears. So that one of the things that's going to do is going to get rid of the negative. And then at the end, we can get back the opposite of squaring by square rooting, so that we get back we go back to that one-dimensional value. The problem here is when you square, these answers are millimeters. The differences are millimeters. Like when you have 8 apples and you eat 5 apples, you have 3 apples left. The unit apples minus apples gives you apples in the units. But if you square those apples, if we square these millimeters, you're going to get millimeters squared, which doesn't make sense. We're talking about millimeters, so you're going to end up taking the square root at the end, right? So, but the purpose of squaring one of them is to get rid of the negative sign. So this 0 squared is 0, negative 2 squared. Again, if you have your calculator, you would do, and you have decimals here, you're going to go and do the calculation of deviation, and then immediately square it, so you don't have to retype the number in. You square it, and it makes this run a lot faster. But since these are, this negative 2 times negative 2, if I were to have negative 2 in the box here and I square it, it's going to give me positive 4. This is positive 4. This is positive 4. 1 times 1 is 1. This is 4. This is 5. And down here, we're going to need to sum that. Okay, so what we've done here is, remember that deviation is symbolized as the original value minus the mean. And if we square it, then that's called the square deviation, or the deviation squared. Okay, and so if we sum this column now, we can actually get an answer. So we're going to sum that column right there. And that column is going to give us something that's called, when we take the sum of this, okay, if we take the sum of these values, which are the square, this is a square deviation, this is a square deviation, this is a square deviation for those values. If we sum that column, you symbolize it this way. And this is sometimes called for short the sum of squares. And it's short for sum of square deviations, right? So it's sum it up, and so I'm going to get my calculator now to make it easier, and I'm going to sum them up. So it's 16 plus 0 plus 4 plus 4 plus 1 plus 4 plus 5. I'm going to make sure I have all of my values in there correctly. 16, 4, 4, 4, 1, 4, 5. And I get, what happened there? So let me try it again. 16 plus 0 plus 4 plus 4 plus 1 plus 4 plus 5. And there's the answer, 34. Okay, so I think when I hit equals again, it added another 5 automatically. So the sum of the square deviations is 4. So remember, this row here is the sums, right? You don't actually need to do this one because we know that should cancel out. If you have decimals and you're rounding, it's not going to be perfectly 0, but it should be close to 0. Okay, so once we do that, it would be nice, we can calculate the average of the sum of the squares, right? And how do we calculate the average of anything? You're going to get the sum of those values. So what are we summing? We're summing this column that's called the square deviations. We are summing from that column the square deviations. That's the sum of the squares that we just defined right here. Okay? And if we were to figure out, well, what's the average of that, we're going to divide by the sample size. Okay? And the sample size is 7 here. Now, because of a technical issue here, and it's beyond the scope of trying to explain it here, just follow this in mechanics, mechanically, when you're in the mechanics of doing this. When you calculate the mean, you use n, but when you're going to calculate the average value for the sum of the squares, there's a technical reason you have to subtract 1 there. Okay, that's called degrees of freedom, and you're going to divide by the number of degrees of freedom. I'm not going to explain what degrees of freedom mean right here, but just make sure that in this equation here you do that. So instead of dividing by 7 like we did for the mean, you're going to divide by 6. It's always 1 less when you're doing this. This answer right here is going to give us something called S squared, which is called the variance. You can actually just go directly past this part. Once we're done, I'll show you. But it is mentioned in your lab manual, so I thought I would mention that. So this is going to be symbolized as S squared, and it's called the variance. So this is your equation for variance. And so we already have the answer to the sum of the square deviations. We just calculated. That's 34. So what's in this box right here is going to go on the top of that equation because this is the sum of the square deviations. So this is going to be 34. And you're going to divide by n minus 1, which is 7 minus 1. That's going to be 6. Okay. So your variance then is going to be 34. It's already on the calculator there, divided by 6. And well, now I have a whole bunch of decimals. So where are we going to round this? We can go ahead and what I would do is not round this, keep it in there. But if we were to write an answer, well, what's the variance? I would write it as 5. It's 5.666. I would write it as 5.7. And then if we're going to report it. Okay. Now we're not done yet. So this would be 5.7. But what I would do is keep the original value in there to not lose any information through rounding error. We're not done because we still need the standard deviation. And you remember, all of these calculations so far were based on squaring. So the units right here would be millimeters squared. Okay? But we need millimeters. And so what are we going to do to get millimeters? We're going to take the square root. So if you take the square root of the variance, you also have to take the square root of the other side of the equation. Okay? And what that ends up giving you is, if you take the square root of s squared, you get s. S is short for standard deviation. Okay? And so if the units actually here were millimeters squared, which is what they are, the answers are millimeter squared, and so on. This answer is millimeter squared. If we take the square root of that value, you're going to get back millimeters, right? Now, what you can do is, because I'm not asking you for the variance, you can just skip the step of calculating. Well, you have to report it here, right? But in practice, when you're doing this with other data sets, you can just calculate the standard deviation directly with this formula. And this is the way the formula for standard deviation will look like in your lab manual. It looks real scary, but the table does this work for you. The table is like a machine that helps you crank out this answer. So just follow the table and it'll give you S. And S is given here at the bottom here. So to show you how this formula would look with skipping the step for variance, we would plug in the numbers here. What goes on the top? What goes on the top is the sum of the squares, which is 34. Okay. What goes on the bottom is the sample size minus 1, which is referred to as your degrees of freedom, and that would be 6. And if we were to divide 34 by 6, which is what you would have to do following order of operations, in the box here, under the radical sign, you're going to get 5.666. So we have that answer right here. It's still in my calculator, right? And when I'm looking for on my calculator here, if you don't have a square root by itself, just the square root of x, there's another way around that. There should be a button that says x raised to the y power. Okay. Now, whatever number you have in the calculator at that time would stand for your x value. Okay. And if you go and you press it, because I don't have just a square root symbol here, right? So what I have here is x raised to the y power, and you can see I'm going to run a calculation now on that, and it has that little TP symbol there. I forget what it's called. But anyway, that's going to tell me what I'm going to raise it to, and the square root is the same as raising to the 1/2 power. So if I were to say take x to the 1/2 power, that's the same as saying the square root of x, okay? Which is also the same as saying x raised to the 0.5 power, because 1/2 is 0.5 power. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to type in 0.5 for the y part of that symbol, and when I do, that gives me the square root. So the square root answer to that is, it shows in the calculator 2.3804, and where we want to round is to the same level of precision as our mean, which is the tenths place. So your final answer for this data set would be 2.4 right here. Okay. Now the way you would report this is similar to the way that they reported in that table before. When we go back to that paper, in that data table, they reported the mean. You can see the X bar there. Let me zoom in a little bit. X bar plus or minus 1 standard deviation. And then they also reported the range. I'm not asking you for the range, but if I ask you for the range on a quiz or a test, give me the low value and the high value in there. Don't give me the difference between the two like the lab manual does. That's my preference for it, okay? So basically, you would write this when you're reporting this this answer here. I just now realized I'm doing this for, it doesn't matter which data set. I intend to do my data set for group A. I still have to go back and do this for group A. I actually did it for group B. You have to do them for both, right? You're going to get different mean and standard deviation. In fact, if I went and sampled group A again, wherever it was in some different pond in some different area, and I went and I sampled it, I'm going to get a different mean and standard deviation every time I do it. All the mean and the standard deviation are an estimated value for the true mean. We don't know the true mean, which is going to be a big concept when we go back to lab exercise 1. So you're going to report your answer as the mean plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So in this case, for my group B tadpoles, the mean is 32.0 plus or minus 2.4, and then you put the units, millimeters, okay? And that's how you might report it in a table, in a lab report. That's how you might report it on a poster if you had to do a science posters, like a science fair type poster. You never go and give your raw data. That you keep in your laboratory notebooks. Sometimes you might include it as an appendix if it's important for your report, or you just have it handy. Somebody might want to ask you if they can use your data so they can compare it against theirs if necessary. And out of courtesy, you provide them with that data, and then they give you credit for that in their reports. Okay, so this is how you calculate mean and standard deviation. I hope it helps. Make sure you go and you practice with your 2 data sets. Doing this, and there'll be plenty of other opportunities to practice, plus you'll have to apply this data analysis to lots of the data that you'll be collecting for the labs this semester. Next time we're going to see how do we determine if the means are different from each other. They're always going to be different. If we look at group A and group B, they're going to be different, but we want to know if they're significantly different. That's coming up in next week's lab. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions. I hope this tutorial helps.